Yeah, I think it's on now. Thank you very much. I'm Alpha K. Bangura from Sierra Leone. I have two interventions here. They are not really questions. The first is I start from what Mr. Joel just presented in terms of procurement on public investment. I think there is also a challenge which you've not mentioned, and this has to do with donor-funded projects. You find out that most donors, they can only give you they are only ready to prepare. Sorry, they are only prepared to fund projects for which they determine who the contractor should be. A typical case is for China. China can only come in when the projects are to be executed by Chinese companies. The same thing for IDB, etc., etc. This is very typical for Sierra Leone. We have a project, say in the extreme part of the east, which is just like a 17-kilometer construction of road, funded by IDB, wherein you have all contractors that mobilize there and members and contractors that are not members of the IDB member states. They said contractors should only come from an IDB member state. It took us over 2 years for us to be able to convince them that no other contractor will mobilize there for just 17 kilometers. So again, that's another area we have to look at. Now, I come to Mr. Dan, who spoke about his experience in various countries, mentioning Sierra Leone, more so in terms of political. He spoke about political. If I can just go back. Yeah. You see, in Sierra Leone, in terms of political maneuvering of public investment projects, what we did was that we established what we know as presidential stock takes, wherein the president directly chairs these stock takes, and we do that by sectors. We have the roads, we have energy, we have water, but prior to that, we also have what we call the pre-stock takes. Before the president comes in, you bring all the actors, everybody, both the contractors, the consultants, the MDA that is responsible, as well as people who are connected to it, the chiefs, etc., etc. We all sit around the table just to ensure that no political challenges, or to see that we're able to address political challenges. But let me tell you what we are experiencing. That's especially for areas where you can say it's not the stronghold of the government. Now, even when you roll out a project there, people there will tell you, this is not the government's area, so we don't want this project. They go to the extent of even chasing contractors. They say this is an APC road because the governing party is APC. They don't really want it. So we really have a challenge there in terms of how we try to maneuver politics in terms of public investment projects. That is a very serious challenge.
Thank you very much for those points, which are very helpful. I think about determination of contractors. Our local contractors can get a greater share of the work, and I think what you mentioned, the Sierra Leone experience, is very like some of the other countries about having some high-level attention to making implementation happen on the ground. Yes, we'll take this question here in the front, please, and then we'll go over here.
From Cambodia. My question regarding to the procurement. This short question. What is the purpose of procurement? In real practice, you said that procurement, we want to have a best outcome, transparency, accountability, but in fact, it takes too long. And even some cases, the price from procurement is higher than the market price. So what is the benefit or efficiency from procurement? I raised the question many times with the World Bank representative in my country as well, but sometimes they just try to ignore my question.
There's a man who will answer your question. Right. It's over here. Yes, right at the back. Yeah.
While Chinese capital investment in Africa is not a bad thing, I tend to worry that it undermines the procurement laws in the country, especially in Kenya and South Sudan and also in Ethiopia. So I'm wondering what would be the advice of the World Bank in regard to this dilemma.
Okay. Yes, please, in the front.
Rosalind Thomas, a couple of, I think, points and one question. On the procurement issue, you spoke about two mistakes: cheapest possible cost and corruption. On the cheapest possible cost issue, what you find with a lot of governments is that they mistakenly look at the cheapest cost as the best bid, not understanding that, frankly, what happens then is whoever has come in the cheapest and gets the bid probably is only lowballing to be able to later raise the cost on, and you end up with cost overruns on the projects because there weren't sufficient controls in place to actually manage it, and they also had the wrong criteria that they were looking at in terms of procurement. One of the things I would like a comment on that, but one of the other things you didn't mention is how does one deal with unsolicited bids coming in, especially from the private sector? And what rules do you put in place to deal with those? And then I think the third question that I have for Dr. Han is you mentioned in your, when you're talking about your the public management system, one of the lessons you learned, I think you said, was economic value was isolated from social value. That point came up this morning, I think, in a different way with Minister Moore. And I think he mistakenly looked at, in his arguments on project preparation issues and feasibility issues, and the fact that, for example, the Millennium Challenge, what do they call themselves, MCC, failed to approve some projects that they were looking at because he says they were looking at economic viability rather than social. But he mistakenly has not understood that, frankly, the social is part of the economic because that's what you're looking at in the bigger scheme. And really what he should have been concerned about was financial viability versus economic being the two that you would look at to try and, one, addressing the economy itself and the other one looking at the financial soundness of the project.
Thank you. Look, I have one question from online question, and then we'll let the panel respond, and then we'll go around for another round of questions. The online question comes from Amina Khan, who's a research officer at ODI, and her question is, how can stakeholders who bear the brunt of bad investment decisions, both within and outside government, hold decision makers to account? For instance, could we have transparent infrastructure investment tracking surveys with a focus on expenditure, infrastructure quality, relevance and credibility as some possible components, and that these tracking surveys would be attached to some strong conditionalities that bind policies to tangible, visible, positive outcomes? So that's one more question to add to the pot. Let me start with you, Jill, because a lot of this was directed at at procurement, which, and I know the World Bank is trying to change its procurement policies.
That's right.
Yeah.
Actually, I think one of the thing that is clear is that procurement is rarely spoken to, but when someone speaks about it, everyone wants to talk about it, because everyone has a procurement story. So I'm going to take these in no particular order, but hopefully I'll deal with them all. In terms of what you're trying to achieve in procurement, I think there's generally sort of belief that you're trying to get the best value for money, which has obviously a time component. If it takes you 4 years to sign a contract, you're unlikely to have actually had best value for money in that process. But best value for money allows you to start thinking about how you don't necessarily only want to have the lowest price at the point of contracting. You want to actually make sure that you, at the time when you get an asset, that asset is actually of high quality, and that you have the amount that has been paid is an amount that is reasonable and allows both parties to benefit. One of the things that, because the private sector has to benefit as well as the public sector, and one of the things I think that we see right now is many of the rules that exist around procurement actually just prevent innovation from happening, either on the private sector side, because private sector firms are required to fill in a very traditional sort of BOQ type approach of the government says this is how much you need to make bags of cement and this is how much you need to do, which actually reduces the ability for the private sector to come up with innovative solutions. One of the reasons I think for this, and this relates to another question, is one of the things that we find is actually countries, not only countries, but the World Bank itself, has a very hard time assessing quality of bids. And the reason that money is often used as the way to make evaluations is it's because simple. You can actually compare pretty quickly one number with another number and know which number is smaller. Once you start actually getting into determining where you get best value for money, it actually requires a level of sophistication of understanding what you need from that asset and what really you want from that asset in order to figure out, are you getting best value for money, and what's that asset, what's the cost considerations around that asset. This goes back to the idea that, so thinking about what's going to be fundamental to improving procurement outcomes is partially building that capacity and aligning the way you make selections in procurement with actually the existing capacities. If you have a system that requires capacity that you don't have, you're unlikely to get good procurement or good value for money. In terms of are there countries that undermine procurement laws? I think in general, there has been a strong belief that donors and outside finances, which create parallel sets of rules, often have undermined and haven't supported the development of national procurement systems. I think that's probably correct. And that's true among many donors, among many bilaterals. I think the fact that you now have new international banks being created that will sort of be required to follow certain rules or expected to follow certain international practices, well, we will see changes going on and evolutions going on in actually how different donors and international agencies deal with procurement. And as domestic resource mobilization becomes much more important than ODA, I think the ability for donors to insist that certain practices happen or certain contractors are preferred, I think becomes smaller and smaller. So my own sense is over time and relatively rapidly, we will see as the focus shifts to domestic resource mobilization, countries using their own money, the ability for donors or others to sort of try to say, no, you must follow our rules in this, will become smaller and smaller. On unsolicited bids, I'm going to sort of park that with the PPP discussion that will come up. I think at some point we do have to actually have, at this point we talk about procurement and PPPs as if they're different universes. They're not really different universes. They're about how the state contracts with the private sector and what's the most efficient mechanism for that contracting. But in terms of unsolicited bids, let's park that. If it doesn't come up in tomorrow's discussion, then let's bring it up, and I'm certainly happy to talk about it.
Thank you very much. There was a question for Dr. Sun on the different. How do you reconcile economic and social values?
Right. Actually, we do the three different analyses: economic analysis and policy analysis and balanced regional development analysis. Actually, normally the economic analysis, before we define the analysis, and we have to know where money come from, so to invest in public projects. And the money comes from our pocket and from the tax. So that's why we have to focus on the social point of view. So when we do the economic analysis, we calculate the cost benefit, we do the BC ratio. And at that time, we only focus on the social point of view. We do not analyze the financial analysis. But in some cases regarding the SOE projects, we do the preliminary feasibility studies regarding the SOE projects. But SOE, the proposal of SOE, the state-owned enterprise, is two things. One is to maximize the social welfare, and another thing is to increase their profitability. That's why we focus on the financial analysis on that case, SOE project PFS, and the policy analysis and the balanced regional development analysis is related to social value. And we can get some results from these kind of analysis. One is qualitative analysis and another is quantitative analysis from BC ratio. That's why we do the different. We need to combine these final these results to get one final figure number. That's why we do the AHP. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, maybe this side of the table, I'll ask the online question that how can stakeholders who bear the brunt of bad investment decisions hold decision makers to account, and the possibility of investment tracking surveys? You could have a National Audit Office perspective and perhaps a perspective from AGI.
I was very struck by something that Joel said in terms of procurement, about there's a lot of data, but there's not a lot of information, I think. So, and I think the same is true about infrastructure projects and their delivery. There's lots of people have lots of opinions and things, but when you actually try and start getting firm data about were they delivered on time to budget, did they deliver the benefits, it's actually very hard. So I think there is something about using the data that is available better and benchmarking and getting that information out to the people that are paying for these projects and are the users of them.
Thank you. Speak on this?
Yeah, I mean, I unfortunately don't have a lot to add on sort of on the financing side that, like, I think that was the focus of the question. I think there's already a lot of really interesting examples of monitoring and public accountability when it comes to the actual implementation side of things and validating and verifying that things are happening as the government says they are. So I think that's where there's, I think, a lot that's already positive and a lot to build on. Just to also, if I can just briefly respond to the comments on Sierra Leone, I think it was a really interesting example of the issue of certain areas of the country that don't accept infrastructure projects, seeing it as sort of a vehicle of a certain party and not something they accept. I talked mainly about the politics of implementation. I think that gets to the sort of importance of playing the politics right, both throughout the process, both in the design, the sort of sensitization up front. So I think there's a whole string of sort of politics that you need to do that come way before the implementation side, where you start to see problems if you haven't done it right up front.
Great, thanks. Let's take another round of questions, please. Oh, lots of hands going up. Let's go right over. Let's go right. We'll go from the extreme right to the, shall we say, extreme right. Maybe the next question will be in the front here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Barnaby Dye from the University of Oxford. And I was just wondering if the panel had any thoughts on the role of participation in infrastructure projects. It seems to me that one of the big mistakes of past sort of booms in the 1970s was that these projects tended to be dominated by experts who weren't necessarily from those countries, creating very top-down ways of implementing projects. And surely if you want to have projects that have the benefits that are realized, like we had in the National Audit Office's work on analysing UK projects, you need to have local communities being part of a discussion of how to make these projects work best for their environment. So I was just wondering if the panel have any opinions on how this is working in this sort of present resurgence of infrastructure that we're now seeing across the world.
Thank you. In the front here, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jill Wells from Engineers Against Poverty. I have a rather rude question for the gentleman from the World Bank. So why did it take you so long to find out these things? Because some of us have known these things for something like 40 years. I've been working in the construction industry, mostly in Africa. And it's now so obvious. Why did it take so long? Mm-hmm. But the serious point I want to make is you also called for integration of these various processes. Delivering, I prefer delivery of a project rather than procurement, because procurement that most people are talking about is simply the appointment of a contractor. Now, most of the work has actually occurred, as we heard in the UK. The important things happen before the contractor is appointed in the traditional system. The planning, the design, the appraisal, which is absolutely essential. And that the more money is put into those early stages, the better the outcomes will be. And yet it's taken so long to actually get the World Bank in particular to look at this as a whole. I was involved in the early discussions for the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative, where which DFID supported, and with the World Bank also engineering. And we were told at first you could only focus on procurement, the point at which the contractor is appointed. No, you can't focus on delivery because the price is determined at the point of procurement, which is ridiculous, of course. The World Bank would not recognise that the project isn't completed until it's completed. And you couldn't discuss the earlier stages because that's the arena for project investment management. And it's only now, it seems, that one is looking, that they are coming to look at the whole chain from the identification of a project, which we heard about this morning. And now, sadly, Mr. Radram was not here this morning to talk about public investment management, because that's an important link that was missing. But Dr. Hahn has now told us what's happening in Korea, which is very, very important. I still think there's things missing, apart from project appraisal, is the design of the project and the budgeting. And that is part of the PIM process, is actually making sure the project is designed and properly included in the budget. And my experience of looking at projects that have gone wrong, two things. First, the design was not completed before the project was started, and therefore you couldn't use the traditional procurement system. And secondly, that the money ran out and delayed payments. Delayed payments in Africa is a really, really big problem. How can you possibly get value for money when you're not paid for 6 months or 9 months?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Let's take a question over. Yes, sir, gentleman behind the camera.
Yeah, Pelle Persson from Swedish Sida. I have a question on the externalities. Now when we're reaching the climate conference soon, it's obvious that how these projects are designed are going to be crucial. And I didn't hear very much from what you said, either when doing the appraisals or the follow-up on the environmental costs. If you could say something about how you treat those in these processes, I think that is crucial. The other part of the question relates to looking into more of a life cycle analysis and than only the investment cost. And it's particularly obvious when it comes to maintenance cost. I used to work in Tanzania, where they reconstructed the main roads every 5 to 10 years because it was much cheaper money to get new donor funds than to do own maintenance. So how do we integrate those kind of things in analysis and follow-up?
I'm glad somebody mentioned operation and maintenance, because we're struggling to get the right decision made to get the project actually completed, but then it does have to be maintained. Yes, at the back on the left here.
Hello, John Hawkins, also from Engineers Against Poverty and from Cost. And Jill kind of stole my thunder slightly, but I have two questions. One is for Geraldine. I reminded there was a report your organisation produced on construction about 15 years ago. Actually, maybe before your time. I think it was, I can't remember what it's called now. And it was amazing, the same things were coming up about integration and collaboration, and about the importance of that, and how the industry's not been very good at moving in that direction. Again, same things the last 50 years. And I'm just wondering what, even now, we're not even getting 1 in 2 projects on time and on budget, which is still better than the 1 in 4 that we had 20 years ago. And I'm just wondering why that might be the case. And then a question for our colleague from South Korea. We've recently come across this clean corruption system in your country now, which is where they're now paying subcontractors directly in South Korea. The UNDP have recently informed us about this. And I don't know if you've come across it, but we're kind of very interested that clients paying subcontractors directly, not going through the supply chain. And that seems to have had some impact. And I'm just wondering if you've come across that, and if that's had any on your work.
Yes, please. Over there.
Thank you. Martin Williams from University College London. I was just really struck by how much of the discussion from kind of practitioners is about the urgent political pressures to get projects done and get things ready, and politicians have short time horizons and that kind of thing. And yet all of our solutions seem to be like more layers of procedures, and kind of good and worthwhile ones, but maybe politically not incredibly feasible. And I was struck in that regard by the experience of Korea that now has this incredibly sophisticated system of appraising and things, but in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s started out with sort of the same, essentially, where most African countries are now, and then sort of gradually added on one layer of one type of feasibility study, and then becoming more and more sort of sophisticated over time, which I thought was an interesting sort of solution to being institutionally realistic.
Thank you for that observation. Let me stop there, and I think we might squeeze in one more round if we can all be quick. So let the panel. Let me throw these questions to the panel. The role of participation, expert top down. I don't know who wants. Do you want to take that down? Whatever. There's some questions about the World Bank procurement, which seems to come up. One on externalities, environment costs, life cycle costs. There's one for Geraldine there on why the construction industry doesn't change or something, and then this tension between getting things done quickly but adding more layers of control and rigor into decision making. So shall we start with you, Dr. Han, and then move down the table?
Yeah, briefly, when we do the PFS, and we calculate total cost, and total cost includes O&M cost, operation and maintenance cost, and environment cost also. The environment cost can be calculated by the CO2 emissions cost. And also we add the land acquisition cost, and after collecting all costs, and we make a 30 years period for transportation projects. So we just discount with the social discount rate, and we calculate the total cost by present value term and the total benefit in present value term. So we can calculate the BC ratio. But it is difficult to calculate the externalities. So I think in my point of view, and we can apply the externalities to balance the regional development analysis in our PFS. So because we consider the regional impact in that analysis. So I think we can apply the externalities into different evaluation items, and also we give different weight on economy analysis and policy analysis and balanced regional development analysis. So in early days, around this 2005, and economy analysis is almost 40 to 50%, and policy analysis is the 20 to 30 to 40%. The balanced regional development analysis is only 10%, but we increased the portion of the balanced regional development analysis to make the equity for the nationwide. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I guess quickly, so I guess I use procurement in the same way that Robert Hunja used procurement to talk through the entire process of identifying and defining technical specifications through the creation of the asset. And I think actually the folding in the maintenance work is actually fundamentally important. And I think that's where sort of we're moving. I think a discussion about value for money doesn't make any sense unless you actually capture all of those different dimensions. In terms of participation, and also the links to the question about are we misaligning the politics and what the recommendations are. So I think what we're seeing is a lot more focus on information and information exchanges and providing greater information to allow political processes to happen. Ultimately, I think if these are about political decision making and holding politicians to account, then the mechanism can't be that donors hold politicians to account or have some triggers. It actually has to be that this gets factored in and utilized in political decision making. So I think our focus a lot these days on things like open contracting and actually our involvement in cost as well is to try and actually dedicate significant resources towards creating better information flows and making that information more accessible to people. Where then the ability to actually hold politicians to account for decision making seems to be quite significant. And in fact, I don't think anything I was saying went to the point of saying we actually have to build in more layers of control. And what I was saying is actually there is a whole sort of creation of information analysis that needs to go alongside this work, and that you have to think carefully about incentives inside the contracting process that may drive outcomes. So I'm not actually suggesting that the solution to either corruption or inefficiency is greater controls. I think actually we have a lot of experience to say those don't actually often lead to greater effectiveness.
Thank you. Sort of quick responses?
Yeah. You've made me very depressed on two counts because it was the first report I ever wrote at the National Audit Office, so it wasn't before my time.
It's on Reddit.
And so, yeah, I went, well, yes, there's an upside. I remembered it. Why isn't it improving? I think we see good practice in some places. I think the issue for me is it's not widespread and it's not embedded and it's not business as usual. And I suspect the reasons as always are complex and very. I do wonder if it's around that planning phase and that rush to do something that's everyone goes into these things for the best of intentions and then we've got a deadline coming up. Let's just get this done. And go back to old habits, but it is something we're very conscious of. In terms of drilling down to what's actually happening, what are the root causes of this, because we don't want to just keep reporting on the symptoms. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, sure. You asked me to comment on the role of community participation in implementation. I guess I think I would distinguish between sort of the role of community participation in sort of feasibility/design, where it's absolutely essential, and in Sierra Leone, the example of what happens when you don't involve the community, it hinders implementation. So I think there it's absolutely essential. I wouldn't say the actual implementation in terms of the execution of a building of a road, that's necessarily the right answer. I used to work for an advisor to the president in Liberia who became very interested in the idea of labor-intensive road building for a while. But the reason he was interested in that was because he knew that job creation was as urgent as any other issue facing Liberia. So I wouldn't be prescriptive in saying, yes, that's the answer, and I don't think he would be either. If you need the road fast, that's more important. If you need the jobs and the road, you might do it the other way.
Okay, and in fact that brings me to a question we've just received online from Bev Hall, who's a research officer at Prospect UK. Her question is, as infrastructure is typically labour intensive, what are the checks and balances that labour is local, long-term maintenance skills are developed, and decent work principles applied? So I'll park that and we can take probably two more questions, and then I'm afraid time's up. Take one question here and one there, please.
Well, I'm actually try to make a comment. And here we are talking about infrastructure implementation. Now, China is known for speedy implementation of the infrastructure. I'm Chinese, so I can't resist to make a comment. What's the difference here? China sees infrastructure as a part of the economic growth strategy. So we talk about infrastructure is needed for economic growth, but it's also job, it's also GDP. So the public sector has the mechanism for accountability and performance. If you got the money ready, got the project ready, you don't implement it. It's a sin for the public sector. So the government officers try all the way to facilitate the implementation of infrastructure. That's on one hand. On the other hand, which I think the donor has not done well enough, is how to support the growth of the domestic construction industry.
Right.
Yeah, this is a big part of the deal. And the Chinese construction industry grow with the public sector, public procurement. Now we have a procurement agent, we have a supervision engineering industry, we have a lot of contractors. And this is the way to really support the infrastructure implementation.
Thank you for that point. And the last question here, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm Francesca Di Mauro from the European Commission. The question related to participation, in fact, is more like economic participation, is again on procurement and on the local content requirement. Perhaps experiencing from South Korea on how to introduce, such local content requirements for procurement, that for international contractors to partner with local contractor, which in theory, can sound very, positive for the local developer, but sometimes it can also be a risk for corruption and, rent-seeking behavior. So just a comment on that.
Thanks. Look, we'll just, I'll let the panel respond very, very quickly to these last comments because our timer is almost up and we have a former Prime Minister waiting. So we'll be trying to be as quick as we can. Is Dr. Han, do you have any you want to add?
And actually, if you understand more clearly about the evaluation system, and actually the line ministries proposed a project plan to the MOSF, the central government, but the line ministry is always related to local governments, so local institutions or local any kind of things, and so we share the budget burden with the local governments and central governments, and depending on the ratio of the budget and the cost. So we cannot adjust the burden of the local government and central government by law, and depending on the type of the sector, type of the projects. So,
thank you. Any final words for us?
So obviously, this issue about how do you? I think both questions were around sort of growth of the domestic industry and the relationship between the domestic industry and jobs and growth. Now, I think they're both. There's no like one sentence answer. It's obviously a pretty fundamental issue that needs to be looked at and in a rigorous way. I do want to say one thing, which is I think unless in countries where we have both bad design and really bad procurement, which often go hand in hand, my sense is you need to be working on both of them at the same time. That if we don't actually improve procurement, then they interact very strongly. So just in terms of thinking about contracting or the actual point of contracting and competition, then I think this focus both on design issues as well as that contracting point are both critical.
Thank you.
Just echo Joel's points that I don't think there's an easy answer to the local content issue at all.
It's not also not exactly an answer to that, but just quickly, I think while I think domestic construction industry challenges are issues in some of the countries we work in, I think there's untapped opportunities in terms of some of the regional companies that I think could be used more, which I think is something that's a real opportunity.
Thanks. Well, let me try and very quickly sum up. I think there's been a very good presentations and a rich discussion afterwards, and I've got 5 points that I'd make. I mean, the first point that seems to come out is getting the investment decisions right in the first place, having clear strategic objectives that can be explained to the public, and I think there was a tendency towards independent, centralized approval processes. We saw this in Korea and Rwanda in particular, and these probably involve the ministries of financial planning. The second point is about recognizing and navigating the politics and how to put in place governance arrangements for projects that reinforce the incentives for bringing the project to completion. And these governance arrangements are probably likely to be outside the executing agency that have decision-making powers, and in low-income, low-capacity countries may even involve the office of the head of government. The third lesson I draw from this is that actually building things is actually quite complicated. I mean, successful implementation requires action, it requires coordination, it requires integration at multiple levels. And this is not not easy. And we've seen that such integration and coordination is difficult even in advanced economies, and let alone in countries where institutional development is at an early stage. One thing that did come up during this meeting is the use of data to inform the oversight of implementation. We're entering this age of big data, and I think data on procurement and on how contracts are actually implemented is a source of information that is, as someone said, hasn't been exploited. The fourth point is to build a culture of project management, procurement, and contract management in countries. Again, this means analyzing the data, doing analysis that leads to efficiency gains. We've seen the potential for that. It means developing the local construction industry, and I've seen examples in countries of joint ventures actually with Chinese companies that are essentially local companies, which are the nucleus of the new construction industry there. I think there's a need to connect some of the things we heard this morning, the macroeconomists' concern about budget execution, with the kind of nitty-gritty engineering detail of how things actually get built on the ground. And my fifth and final point I'll take away from this is the need to strengthen project oversight, accountability, and probably its independence, and the importance of not losing sight of the benefits, the project outcomes, because investment is really a means to achieving these. It's about setting realistic plans, milestones, and monitoring them. Now, that summary probably doesn't do full justice to the discussions, to the presentations, and I'm sure there'll be a written record of this meeting later. So thank you very much to the panel for, I think, excellent presentation.